In this video, I'm reviewing Go Fundamentals by Mark Bates and Cory LaNou. Hi, I'm Jonathan Hall, and if you've been watching my channel at all, you know that I'm reviewing a bunch of books about learning to program in Go. I'm trying to find the best book in 2023 to help you learn the Go programming language. So back in December, I ordered 6 books on Amazon.com about programming in Go. And I started publishing the reviews in January on my blog and on YouTube. And I had viewers point out this book, which was just published at the end of December, just a few days before Christmas. So that's why I didn't know it existed when I ordered the first 6. So I ordered this. I've also ordered a few others that viewers have recommended. So I have a few more coming. So let's see how this book goes, if this is a good one. Now, the first thing I noticed when I got this book, I didn't know when I ordered on Amazon.com how big it was. But when it came in the mail, I thought they had made an error and sent me 2 copies of the book because the package was so thick. Then I opened it up and I found this monster. It's a big book, 570 some pages. So, okay, hopefully it's an in-depth book full of juicy details, right? Let's see what we find. So first, who is the book for? On the back cover, it says, the book is specifically designed to get you up to speed fast, to leverage your existing knowledge of other languages, and to help you avoid common mistakes made by Go newcomers. So it's clear that it's for people who already know other language or languages. And then the book, of course, also talks about other languages in some of the examples, especially when comparing and contrasting Go to other things, like compiled languages versus interpreted languages. But you're not going to necessarily need to know those specific languages to understand the book. Like the example it gives in Ruby, I've never used Ruby, but the example makes perfect sense. I don't need to know Ruby. So the book is for people who already know a language or other languages. It's really intended for those sorts of people. This is not an introductory to programming book at all. So if you're brand new to programming, this isn't for you. Now, under the writing style, for my personal taste, the narration or the prose style in this book is a little bit dry. It's not a problem. It's not distracting. But I would just describe it as like it feels like a professor giving a lecture rather than like a friend sitting next to me describing things. Some of the other books, like Learn Go with Pocket-Sized Projects, I really felt like it was a very friendly book, welcoming. Like I kind of felt like I had a mentor sitting next to me, walking me through the language. This feels more like a lecture. And I don't want to say that's good or bad. It's just different. So just be aware of that. There's also a few places where the book feels a little bit redundant or extra wordy, like it uses more words than necessary to explain something. I'm going to read a quote here just to make that clear what I'm talking about. So in chapter 2, as it's talking about strings, introducing that concept, it says, strings exist within either back quotes or double quotes in Go and have different characteristics depending on which quotes you use. If you use the back quotes, you're creating a raw string literal. If you use the double quotes, you're creating an interpreted string literal. Interpreted string literals are character sequences that begin with double quotes. And then the next page, raw string literals are character sequences that between back quotes. Not a big deal. I don't want to make it sound like this is terrible writing or anything, but it just feels a little bit over redundant to sort of twice explain that the single quotes versus double quotes. And there's other places in the book where it kind of does that too. Like it explains something and then it maybe re-explains it in slightly different wording. I don't know. I guess that could be useful to really drive the point home. But for a book that's already almost 600 pages long, it feels like maybe that could be edited to be shorter a little bit. I don't know. Let me talk about the organization of the book. The book is organized in a very logical, progressive way. Now, I say very logical. It's not to say it's not without drawbacks. I'll get to that in a second. But let me read from the preface where it explains about the book here and how it's meant to be used. The author says, "We have laid this book out with the idea that it is meant to be read from start to finish. We have gone through great effort to try to make sure that the examples and chapters don't contain any new information that we haven't covered up to that point. Occasionally we do have to break this rule though. In those instances we try our best to explain the concept or point to the chapter where it is explained." Now, I've mentioned this in some of the other review videos as well. You know, it's a challenge when you're writing technical documentation or tutorial. You have this challenge to explain things in a logical way that the student or the listener or reader can understand. that depend on other concepts. There's kind of a house of cards of knowledge, and it's hard to explain this piece here without explaining everything underneath of it. So this book has done an interesting job of solving this problem by being very explicit that you read the book from front to back. And if you do that, you're going to get all the information you need. But what that means, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what that means is that some of the things are in a little bit funny order. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. So it's in a logical order, and it's built on a progressive order of topics. So to start with, I guess one of the ways that presents itself in maybe a surprising way is that the very first chapter is about modules and packages, which makes sense in this view, right? If you consider the goal, that makes sense. So chapter 1 is about modules, packages, files, and these sorts of things. And then it's not until chapter 2 that we even mention data types and strings and all this stuff. So, usually sort of the common way that programming is taught is you start with hello world, and then you start to break it down and explain what the different bits are. And then that's exactly what Learn Go with pocket-sized projects did. But this one, it's really more conceptual in that sense. So it takes you through the concepts of modules and packages, and then it talks about how Go is written in terms of the data types and all those things. Now, as I started to talk about this progressive nature, this building on previous knowledge, does make for some unusual ordering of some topics. I just want to give one example of that. So on page 274 is where we start really discussing how to avoid the dereference of a nil value. That's more than halfway through the book. Now, the reason that this is discussed here, and this is a problem that trips up practically every newbie with Go, but the reason it's put at this part of the book is because that when you dereference a nil value in Go, you get a panic. And this is the part of the book that talks about panics and recovering from panics. Now, why is panic talked about so late? Well, because it's talked about in the context of error handling. And error handling is talked about late because in Go, errors are an example of an interface type. So we need to talk about interfaces first. So that happens earlier in the book. So you can sort of see the why it makes sense to do things in this order, but why that makes for an order that isn't maybe the most natural. You're going to learn things in an order that you don't necessarily encounter them in the real world. The table of contents is quite detailed. Let me just try to demonstrate here. You can see each chapter is broken down with all the subpoints there. So it does make browsing through the table of contents quite simple and easy. You can expect what to find. There is also a detailed index. My only complaint about the index is that the typeface is small. It's hard for me to read with my old aging eyes. Let's move on to the content of the book, because of course that's what you're here for. That's the star of the show. First off, most important, this book hits all the highlights I have been looking for. It talks about Go modules. The first chapter is Go modules. It talks about testing. There's a whole chapter on that, and there's a whole chapter on generics. So these three things that have been the things I'm really looking for and expecting in an introductory book, they're all here and in great detail. There's also a lot of detail here on some topics that usually get much lighter coverage in other books. There's a full chapter on errors, what they are, how to wrap errors, how to unwrap errors, all those good things. There's a full chapter on channels, which also talks about Go routines. There's a full chapter on context, which most of these introductory books have completely ignored or just barely mentioned. So it's nice to see that, because context really is a really important part of Go. And there's a full chapter on synchronization, on locking and unlocking and the different ways to synchronize multiple Go routines. So there's a lot of information in this book. And I would say that for the topics that are covered, this book is incredibly thorough, maybe to the point of being overwhelming for some people. In the first chapter, for example, as we're learning about dependency management, there's a ton of information there. And one of the things it talks about is that you can actually import two versions of the same module, assuming they're using semantic versioning correctly. So you can import version 1 and version 3, for example. This is something rarely done. I've done it twice, I think, in my 8 years as a Go programmer. It's certainly not the kind of thing that a beginner would be doing. I honestly don't think that detail needs to be in the book. That's like a footnote at the bottom of a highly technical and manual type of thing, not the main thing in a book that's aimed for beginners, in my opinion. You're not going to just start writing Go code on chapter 1 or chapter 2. You kind of have to read through significant portions of this book before you build up enough fundamental knowledge to start writing practical code. Now, one small complaint I have about the content in this book, it's really subtle. It's a praise and a complaint sort of mixed in one. On page 17, we're shown the output of the go doc command. And I think that's kind of cool. And it does that throughout the book, actually. It shows go doc and then the name of a package or a function. And this is a great way to demonstrate how go doc works. This is a feature that I think a lot of people don't know exists. But you can just type go doc and, like I said, the name of a package and optionally a symbol or a function in that package, and it will show you the documentation for that thing. And that's really powerful and it's great. And this is a really cool way to demonstrate that in the book. The problem is they never explain it in the book. So they show this little output example that shows the go doc command, but they never anywhere that I can find, and it's not in the index, explain, here's what go doc is and here's how you use it, and you should try to use it. It doesn't explain that. So if you read carefully, you'll notice that happens, and you can read between the lines enough to pick that out and learn to use go doc. But it nowhere explicitly explains that. So it's a praise and a complaint at the same time, wrapped in one there. And then finally, there's a few topics that I was surprised to find are not covered. Now, the first one is that iota is not covered in here, which is kind of an important feature in Go. I've talked about that in some of the other videos where they either talked about it too much or not enough. This one doesn't mention it at all, and it's not in the index. And then another one that's less important, goto isn't mentioned that I can find, except in the list of keywords, but it's not explained. It's not on the index. It's a feature you shouldn't be using, but the fact that it's not mentioned in a book this long is a little bit surprising. It makes me wonder what other things I haven't thought of that I should have looked for that aren't here. Neither of those is going to really trip anybody up, but it's surprising in a book this size and this detailed to not have those features mentioned. Now, on to accuracy. In a book this large, you can expect there to be errors, and I have found a few. Not very many, but a few. One example, on page 113, it's talking about initializing maps, and it mentions, it says, unlike slices and arrays, maps cannot be initialized with a length and capacity. And that's misleading. You actually can initialize a map with a capacity. Now, the capacity isn't a hard limit, but it isn't with a slice either. So, it's really the same sort of thing. The capacity, when you initialize a map that way, is just sort of a hint to the runtime to allocate that much memory, so that it doesn't have to reallocate more memory later on. So it's a sort of a micro performance improvement option. Probably a little bit more significant error or typo, probably, on page 38 is talking about runes, and it says, quote, a rune is an alias for int 32 and is used to represent individual characters. A rune can be made up of 1 to 3 int 32 values. Now, I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say here. I think they're trying to say that a rune can contain multi-byte Unicode characters, but they didn't say it correctly, because they say that a rune is an alias for int 32 and that it can contain 1 to 3 int 32s. You can't have 3 int 32s in a single int 32. So it's clearly wrong. I'm not sure what it meant. I'm sure it's just a typo. Maybe they meant 1 to 3 int 8 values. I don't know. And then a final example of an ambiguous statement that I would love to have an answer to. On page 4, at the very beginning of the book, it says, quote, a package is a collection of Go files that share the same import path. These files are almost always in the same directory as each other. But it never goes on to explain that I have found the exceptions to this almost always rule. When can files of different packages be in different directories? I'm honestly unaware of any exception to this, so I'm quite curious. If there is an exception, if you know of it, leave a comment. I want to hear. I'm quite curious what they meant by this, or if it was an oversight. Physically, this book, well, you already know it's big. It's a large book. What is that, 1.5 inches? I don't know. It's a big book. Aside from that, though, that being its most outstanding physical characteristic, it's a pretty book. It's a good book. It's written on white paper with black ink. Pretty easy to read. Well formatted and so on. No complaints there. My only minor nitpick is that for my eyes, the font is a little bit small. And then, as I mentioned in the index, the font is really small. It's actually, I have to squint. It's really hard for me to read the index. So I'm really at the end of my review. Let me talk about my conclusions. I will be leaving a 4-star review on Amazon for this book. I would give it 4.5 stars if that were possible, but I can't. I have to do whole stars. The only reason I wouldn't do 5 stars for this book is that I feel the biggest drawback is the progressive buildup of topics. And that is both a strength and a weakness. And so depending on your preference, you may choose to disregard my half-star deduction. What I would probably recommend though to somebody if they choose to read this book is to make this your second book on Go. Start with a shorter, quicker introduction to sort of get you up to speed and started, and then use this one to go in and fill in those gaps. So once you've sort of got the basics down, you're already writing Hello World, maybe written a small CLI tool or something like that. You have the basics down, but you're still new. Maybe you've been using Go for a month or two, and now you're ready to flesh out your Go knowledge. That's where I would go for this book. So that's my recommendation for this book. I think this would make a great second book to read for Go. On the other hand, if you are a person who enjoys the technical sort of abstract details first, before and you're willing to get through several hundred pages of that before you really start to write code, this could be a great starting point as well. So there you have it. I'm getting near the end of my series on reviews, and soon I will be publishing my final recommendation, and I think this book will be near the top of that recommendation list. But I'll be publishing my final recommendation for the best book for you to read in 2023 to learn Go. So be sure to hit subscribe so you get notified when that comes out. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it as well. One last thing I want to mention, if you're learning Go, or maybe you've already been using it for a while, I write a daily blog 5 days a week about Go. And right now I'm in a series about the Go spec. I'm taking just one small topic from the Go spec in order every day and explaining it in easy to understand terms. If you would like to be a part of that, head over to boldlygo.tech/daily. You can submit your email address there, and I'll send you that email every day. And if you find that anything that I write in that list is confusing or doesn't make sense, just hit reply. The replies come straight to me. They don't go to some robot somewhere. They go straight to me. So I'd love to hear from you. So I hope to see you there. And until next time, boldly go.